Have you ever stopped to wonder if your morning coffee order was entirely predestined? I mean, really think about it. Were you always going to order exactly that at exactly that moment? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are embarking on a rigorous yet incredibly fascinating exploration into one of the most mind-bending intersections in human thought. We are going to dive deep into how the highly sensitive, chaotic physics of our universe, the philosophical frameworks of determinism, and the ancient theology of biblical prophecy all collide. For centuries, philosophers, theologians, and scientists have fiercely debated whether we are the autonomous authors of our own destiny or if we're simply actors reading from a meticulously pre-written script. By the end of this analysis, you are going to see how classical theology doesn't actually conflict with modern chaos theory at all. Instead, it fully absorbs it to form what we call the causal architecture of destiny. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but I promise it's worth it. Let's get right into it.
Here's a quick look at the roadmap for our analysis today. We'll start with chaos and the butterfly effect, then move into determinism versus predestination. From there, we'll look at prophecy as predestined decree and tackle the deeply controversial illusion of free will. Finally, we'll ground it all with scriptural case studies before synthesizing everything in the architecture of destiny.
All right, part 1, chaos and the butterfly effect. Before we can talk about destiny, we have to look at the fragile, interconnected physical reality of the universe we actually live in.
To really grasp the sheer, terrifying sensitivity of our reality, we have to rewind to the 1960s and look at the groundbreaking work of an American mathematician and meteorologist named Edward Lorenz. According to the scholarly text, Butterfly Effect, Certainty of Uncertainty, Lorenz was using a very early computer to run meteorological weather models. During his experiments, he stumbled onto something that completely upended the scientific world's understanding of predictability. He wanted to replicate a specific weather pattern he'd run previously. But to save time, he rounded off the starting values by a microscopic quantity, specifically a rounding error as tiny as 1 part in a million. To put that into perspective for you, it's literally like trying to calculate the exact weight of a massive skyscraper, but you're off by the weight of a single eyelash. You'd think that wouldn't matter at all, right? Well, what Lorenz found was absolutely astounding. That imperceptible, tiny alteration didn't just slightly shift the weather, it produced a vastly, entirely different macroscopic outcome. As detailed in another paper we're analyzing today, titled The Butterfly Effect, Divine Providence, and Occasionalism in Islam, this concept mathematically proves that in complex systems, whether we're talking about global weather, the stock market, or human society, minute inputs propagate into enormous, world-altering effects. Nothing is truly trivial. Every single thing exists in a web of contingent, highly sensitive relationships. In physics, this means the universe is essentially deterministic, yet practically unpredictable to human observers, simply because we cannot measure the initial conditions with enough microscopic precision.
And that brings us to Lorenz's most famous metaphor, posed at a conference in 1972. It brilliantly illustrates the staggering scale of cause and effect we are talking about. A butterfly's wings create this incredibly gentle disturbance in the air, right? Which then slightly alters the currents around it, which interact with larger air currents, eventually culminating in a massive, devastating hurricane thousands of miles away. But listen, this isn't just about meteorology. According to the article, The Butterfly Effect in Our Decisions, Life, Hope, and Truth, this terrifying ripple effect plays out constantly in human history. The article points to the chilling historical example of a young man named Gavrilo Princip in 1914. Through a chaotic, entirely unpredictable chain of random events, including a driver deciding to take a wrong turn down one specific random street, Princip suddenly found himself standing directly in front of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His single split-second decision to pull a trigger served as the ultimate butterfly flap. That one micro-event ignited World War I, leading to the deaths of tens of millions of people, toppling empires, and permanently reshaping the entire modern world. The timeline of human history literally hangs by a thread of infinitesimally small variables.
So, that's the physical science. Let's pivot now to part 2, determinism versus predestination. We need to look at the philosophical frameworks that attempt to make sense of this chaotic, causal chain.
Let's exhaustively contrast these two worldviews because they are often confused but fundamentally different. According to the text Determinism Wikipedia, causal determinism posits that there is an unbroken, rigid chain of prior occurrences stretching all the way back to the very origin of the universe. It proposes that every single event results strictly from preceding events and natural, physical laws. In this framework, the universe is just a closed, mechanical system. It's an unfeeling machine. The outcomes are absolutely necessary, yes, but they are driven by blind necessity. There is no ultimate goal, there is only the cold chain of physical cause and effect. On the flip side, we have biblical predestination.
According to the highly detailed analysis in the text The Causal Architecture of Destiny, theological predestination replaces that blind necessity with something called divine teleology. Teleology simply means there is an ultimate end goal or purpose. In this framework, the global boundary conditions and the macro-level trajectories of the entire universe are established by an omnipotent, omniscient creator. The causal chain is still entirely unbreakable, just like in scientific determinism, but instead of being driven by random, blind physics, it is actively decreed and sustained by a deity who is deliberately directing history toward a very specific pre-chosen conclusion.
Now, what is absolutely fascinating is how these concepts merge. According to the text Free Will and Determinism, Some Varieties, predeterminism is the exact view that combines God with determinism. It holds that every single event throughout all of eternity has been foreordained in a strict causal sequence. Think about what this actually means under the constraints of strict predestination. It means every micro-event, every single flap of a butterfly's wings, every wrong turn taken by a driver, every text message you sent today is fixed in advance. There is absolutely no room for true randomness or unmanaged chance anywhere in the cosmos. If our universe is as insanely sensitive to initial conditions as chaos theory scientifically proves it is, then for God to guarantee a specific end to human history, he has to completely author the beginning, and he has to actively sustain every single microscopic link in between. If even one rogue atom were to operate completely outside of this foreordained sequence, the cascading butterfly effect would completely derail eternity.
Moving right along to Part 3, Prophecy as Predestined Decree. Let's narrow our focus from these broad philosophical ideas to a very specific theological mechanism.
Prophecy is incredibly misunderstood in modern culture. Most people think of it as just a divine prediction, like God peers into a cosmic crystal ball, sees what autonomous humans are eventually going to do, and then reports back to a prophet. However, according to the deep research text Predestination, Prophecy, and Causality, this is a fundamental, massive theological error. Prophecy is absolutely not a divine guess. It is the explicit, public announcement of an unbroken causal chain that has already been orchestrated by God. This structure actually operates in three distinct parts. First, you have the decree. This is the overarching, unchangeable plan of God that guarantees specific outcomes based entirely on His sovereign will. Second is the disclosure. This is the actual verbal communication of that predetermined plan into human history before it happens. It acts as a massive informational perturbation in the timeline. And finally, you have the contingency. These are the chaotic variables, the messy human decisions, the butterfly effects. In biblical theology, the butterfly effect isn't a threat to prophecy at all. It is the exact mechanism through which providence works. God predestines the entire causal chain, perfectly ensuring that all contingent, seemingly random variables perfectly execute His exact decree.
This brings us to Part 4, the illusion of free will. And I warn you, this is where things get intensely skeptical and highly controversial.
We have to look at this with strict, critical, academic rigor. Think about the massive domino effect required for just one major historical prophecy to be fulfilled perfectly. According to the arguments presented in Predestination, Prophecy, and Causality, if a human agent possessed absolute, uncaused freedom to make a totally independent choice, say deciding to miss a flight, or deciding to stay home instead of going to a specific party, the entire sequence of history shifts dramatically. If humans actually possessed absolute independent autonomy, a single unmanaged rogue decision by one person would inevitably derail the entire prophetic timeline. For God to absolutely guarantee an outcome thousands of years in advance, He mathematically cannot leave the choices of human agents to random chance. It simply wouldn't work.
Because of this, we have to rigorously dismantle what philosophers call libertarian free will. Libertarian free will is defined as the absolute, autonomous power to do otherwise, totally independent of any prior causes, physics, or divine plans. But as the text Predestination, Prophecy, and Causality forcefully argues, if the butterfly effect is real, and we know it is, an unguided, truly autonomous human will is a chaotic variable the universe simply can't afford to let exist. Instead, this theological framework demands what we call a script-bound will. This means human choices are completely real, you actually deliberate, and your choices carry massive moral weight, but they are entirely enclosed and guided by a primary divine decree. You are making choices, yes, but the parameters, your intrinsic desires, and the environment shaping those choices are meticulously authored. Think of it exactly like an open-world video game. When you play, you are making real choices, exploring the map, fighting enemies. But the developers coded the boundaries, the physics engine, and the ultimate ending of the narrative long before you ever picked up the controller. Your freedom is very real, but it is entirely contained within their script.
So, the crucial, unifying point is captured perfectly right here, expanding heavily on this quote directly from the text, predestination, prophecy, and causality. We encounter the profound principle of dual causality. The obvious question is, how on earth can a will be constrained by God, but a person still be held morally accountable? The answer classical theology provides is that a human being always, without exception, acts according to their strongest desire in any given moment. You always choose what you want to choose, so you act willingly. You aren't being physically coerced by an invisible hand. Therefore, you are fully guilty of your crimes and absolutely responsible for your actions. However, God is the ultimate author of the exact circumstances, your intrinsic nature, and the boundaries that dictate those very desires. He determines what the human will wants in the first place, thereby perfectly guiding the ultimate outcome with absolute precision, without ever violently violating the human mechanism of choice.
All right, Part 5, Scriptural Case Studies. Metaphysical theories are great, but we need concrete evidence. Let's look at the ancient texts themselves to see this in action.
The most profound, exhaustive exegesis of this entire concept is found in the historical accounts of the betrayal and denial of Christ, documented in Matthew 26 and Luke 22. According to the deep dive in predestination, prophecy, and causality, Jesus made a highly specific, totally incredible prediction. He told Peter that Peter would deny him exactly 3 times before a rooster crowed. Furthermore, Christ's death was decreed as a fixed, unalterable reality. But stop and actually look at the staggering, almost absurd number of chaotic human variables required to fulfill this prophecy precisely. Judas Iscariot had to freely choose the exact right moment to walk out and bargain with the priests. The temple guard had to select a very specific physical route through the city to Gethsemane. Later that night, in a crowded courtyard, an unnamed servant girl had to just happen to notice Peter by the fire, and she had to autonomously choose to ask him a highly provocative question. And Peter had to experience the exact precise psychological level of fear necessary to deny Jesus exactly 3 times. Not 2, not 4, exactly 3, right before a very specific bird happened to wake up and crow. If that servant girl gets distracted and looks away, the entire prophecy fails. This is the butterfly effect, fully active, yet perfectly, flawlessly managed by divine decree to fulfill the single most important event in biblical history.
The Apostle Peter, the very guy who denied him, later unpacks this exact dynamic in the book of Acts. He stands before the crowds and tells them that Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan of God, yet killed by the hands of lawless men. This one sentence perfectly encapsulates the massive theological paradox we're discussing. The actors involved, Judas, Pilate, the screaming crowd, were entirely self-determined. They acted purely on their own wicked, corrupted desires, yet they could not deviate a single millimeter from God's definite, pre-written script. They were fully morally responsible, yet their actions were fully determined.
Let's look at another striking account found in 1 Samuel 14. A warrior named Jonathan establishes a strict, entirely conditional test based purely on the random verbal response of his enemies. He decides if the Philistine guards say, "Wait," he'll hold back. But if they say, "Come up to us," he will attack. According to the analysis laid out in Predestination, Prophecy, and Causality, God deliberately embedded a highly specific butterfly effect trigger into a completely casual human conversation to reveal his hidden decree. Think about it. God didn't bypass the guards' brains and force their vocal cords to move. They spoke out of their own genuine, autonomous military arrogance. Yet God completely controlled the chaotic variable of their speech, turning their freely spoken, cocky words into the exact mechanism that triggered their own pre-decreed defeat.
And honestly, we see this exact structural paradigm everywhere in the text. Look at the famous story of Joseph. His brothers act on genuine, malicious, deeply personal envy to sell him into slavery. Their will is highly active and highly evil. Yet, as the paper The Causal Architecture of Destiny explicitly notes, that very sinful desire was exactly the mechanism needed to fulfill God's prophecy to preserve their entire nation from a famine years later. We see the same thing with the prophets. We constantly see God judging Israel by using foreign armies. Pagan rulers, like the massive Assyrian Empire's generals, planned invasions based purely on their own ruthless imperial geopolitical ambitions. They wanted land and gold. Yet God explicitly states in the text that he is using their totally autonomous military tactics as his precise hand-picked instrument of judgment. Absolutely no variable, whether it's the petty jealousy of a sibling or the grand, complex strategy of a military commander, is truly independent of the primary cause.
This entire dynamic is brutally, poetically summarized by the prophet Isaiah. Explicitly citing the commentary in Predestination, Prophecy, and Causality, this incredible quote exposes the ultimate, laughable absurdity of human pride. For a massive empire or even an individual student like you to claim total independence from God's causal architecture is literally as ridiculous as a metal axe verbally boasting against the lumberjack who's swinging it. The tool is real, yes, it does the actual cutting, but the lumberjack who wields it determines the target, the angle, and the force.
Okay, we've finally reached part 6, the architecture of destiny. We have traveled from 1960s meteorology to deep philosophy to ancient scriptural texts. Now, let's synthesize this entire framework.
Let's spend a moment walking through this matrix. This outlines classical theology's brilliant resolution to the intense tension between human choice and divine determinism. Looking at the top row, we have primary causality. This asserts that God is the ultimate foundational source directing all of history toward his pre-chosen end. In relation to the butterfly effect, this means God actively sustains every single microscopic causal link. There are exactly 0 unmanaged variables in the entire universe. Moving down, we have secondary causality. This is what validates human existence. Created things actually act according to their own specific natures and desires. Human choices are very real second causes. They have massive real-world impacts, but they always inevitably operate entirely within the unshakable scope of the primary plan. And finally, the synthesis of these two results in compatibility. The absolute, unyielding sovereignty of the divine coexists perfectly with genuine human responsibility. God determines both the chaotic variables, the gentle flap of the wings, and the final result, the hurricane.
Thus, we formally arrive at compatibilism. As a strict academic definition, it is the philosophical view that absolute divine sovereignty and determinism are entirely logically compatible with genuine, yet script-bound, human moral responsibility. This framework is absolutely crucial because it allows for human actions to carry immense, terrifying moral weight without ever once risking the absolute guarantee of the prophetic timeline. Hear this: your choices matter immensely. They have real devastating or beautiful consequences, and you will absolutely be held accountable for them. But they will never, ever surprise the architect, nor will they ever alter the final predetermined destination of the system.
Summarizing the core thesis of our explainer today, we look to the paper The Causal Architecture of Destiny, which argues that the butterfly effect is simply the physical engine of a deterministic universe. Prophecy, then, is an informational perturbation deliberately injected into that physical system by the Creator. The butterfly cannot change the future because the exact flap of its wings, at that exact millisecond, at that exact geometric angle, was already written into the script from before the foundation of the world. Chaos theory isn't a disproof of God. It is merely the scientific observation of God's infinitely complex, perfectly managed tapestry from our very limited, finite human perspective.
I want to leave you today with a profound, lingering question, something to deeply reconsider about the nature of your own daily reality. Tomorrow, as you go about your life, making what feel like totally autonomous decisions regarding your university studies, your relationships, your career, and your future, consider this. If your every desire, every impulse, and every decision is actually a secondary cause, perfectly woven into an unbreakable divine script, are your choices truly yours? Or are you simply a perfectly placed domino, falling exactly as intended in the grand architecture of destiny? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep intellectual journey. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we'll see you in the next explainer.